Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is a podcast for both kids and adults. It's two podcasts in one. One where we tell great stories and go through great books. And the other one is We Just Learn, where we dive into people and tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. Today, let's learn about the year 1814, the attack on Washington, D.C. August 1814, right smack towards the end of the War of 1812, when the British burned down our capital city. Now, before we dive into this unbelievable episode in our history, so long forgotten, between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, yes, this was 38 years shortly after we had become a new country, and here we are fighting against Britain again. So going back to our previous episode on the year 1811, why were we fighting the British again? Well, very simply, they were kidnapping our soldiers, they were arming the Native Americans, and they live still just north of us in Canada. This wasn't independent Canada that we know today. The British were still on the continent. They were still not getting along with us. And ultimately, it became a reality because Britain was fighting against France in the Napoleonic Wars. And they just had a lot of issues, and they took it out on us. We had had enough. We wanted to be on the world stage. There were these people in Congress called the Warhawks that felt we should have Canada. We should stand up to our old parent, our current enemy. And this is what led us to war. It was a three-part plan on the British end. What they wanted to do first was to come down from Canada into New York State and establish control of that area. Then they wanted to blockade or block all the coastal cities along the eastern coast, primarily take control of Baltimore, Washington, D.C., the capital. And by blockading, they wanted to suffocate us in terms of our economy, in terms of no trade happening. And yes, these first two parts of the plan had been working. And the third idea from the British perspective was to take control of New Orleans, and with that they would have control of the Mississippi River, and our ideas about expanding west would be over. What was our plan? We really made some crucial mistakes. Our army was just very young at this point. There was basically just a lot of militia. There was not a formal trained army per se. And of course, our country was large at this time. But the key calculation was we just thought we would be able to march into Canada and take over. And this was not the case. Believe it or not, the old argument about us becoming a country with taxation, well, there were a lot of people that were living in Canada at this time that were taxed a lot less. Even though we thought they would come over to our side in our initial battles up in the Great Lakes region, that wasn't the case. There were a lot of loyalists in Canada. So a combination of militias, armies that were not top tier, and really a good pushback from the Redcoats in Canada, it was pretty much a stalemate at the beginning of the war. So here we are now, and the British are about to implement their second part of their plan to take over America again. They were ready for the fight now. The war over in Europe was coming to an end, and now they could bring the resources over to America, everything from more sailors to more soldiers to more weapons, everything. And here's the major point. They were angry. What did we do? Even though it seemed like a stalemate in the early part of the war with many battles on the coast of us in Canada, we had gone into York, which is present-day Toronto, and burned their capital city down. Yes. So for a lot of the people on the ground running the war, the Redcoats were out for revenge, and the target was Washington, D.C. So it's August 1814. Like I said, our country is barely 40 years old. Our capital, Washington, D.C., is nothing but a muddy village. It's not a big metropolis. It's not a big city. There are dirt roads. There's little scattered government buildings. There's only 8,000 people. It was a city that was built up from the ground from nothing. And it's just being built still. So on a hot, sticky afternoon, yes, the enemy in bright red coats is marching straight toward the heart of our government. We're not talking New York, Boston, Philadelphia. We're talking Washington, D.C. And there's no one to stop them. This is a story about how the Brits captured and burned down our Capitol, our White House, and so many government buildings, and we didn't even put up a fight. It's unbelievable. See, here's what happened. Our president at the time was James Madison. You can go back to my previous episode on him and his wife, but he was not an experienced commander out in the field in terms of leading armies and navies. Yes, he's the president, but this was not his wheelhouse. These were not his talents. So, despite the reality on the ground, James Madison didn't help the situation. The city was only protected by small militias and just regular people. Farmers, clerks, shopkeepers, no one. When I say no one, I'm referring to not trained armies. Not a lot. In fact, Madison and the government could see that the British were going to possibly attack, but they really thought they were going to go to Baltimore. They didn't really think they were going to come to Washington, D.C. So there were about the same number of soldiers, quote unquote soldiers, on our end, about 4,000 to 5,000, with the same number of redcoats about to enter the city. But when we're talking about the numbers being about the same, we're not talking about the quality of the numbers, the quality of the soldiers, like I just mentioned. You had battled veterans from the Napoleonic War on the redcoat side, ready for a fight, and we had soldiers that were just the opposite. So here's how everything unfolded. August 24th, 1814, a date every American should know. Around 12 noon in the town of Bladensburg, Maryland, about 9 miles northeast of Washington, D.C. The British were commanded by Major General Robert Ross, and yes, Rear Admiral George Cockburn. He was the one that wanted revenge, and more than anyone else, really looking for a fight. We were led by Brigadier General William Winder and Commodore Joshua Barning. You may be thinking, I haven't heard of these people. Well, there's a reason for that. Because while the numbers were basically the same, like I mentioned before, this battle was over almost before it began. The day was brutally hot, 90 degrees, and as the Redcoats advanced, they fired these concrete rockets. Yes, these cylinder rockets, almost like fireworks today, but they were shot from like a tripod, and this was something new and scary. They weren't effective, really, from a strategic standpoint in terms of making sure that their targets were reached. A lot of these rockets, like fireworks today, they just exploded overhead, But what they did was they scared this inexperienced American, mostly militia. They screamed. The rockets exploded. They flashed. The noise terrified everyone. And yes, we ultimately ran. The collapse of this line, and the line was not, it was like Swiss cheese. It was not executed correctly. And they ultimately referred to this battle where we tried to stop them from entering D.C. as the Bladensburg races because everyone ran away. And what is so remarkable about this early defense outside the Capitol is our president was there. He actually was on the battlefield with our future president, the next president, who was Secretary of State at the time, James Monroe. They were helping, they watched, and they helped with positioning the troops. And at one point, yes, some of the skirmishes got close enough that shots literally whistled past James Madison's head. And at this point, his officers quickly told him to move out of sight. But yes, our president, talk about ending everything at that moment, almost was captured, almost was killed. What if? The one person that ultimately stood firm of all the thousands we had defending the city, there was 500 talented soldiers under Commodore Joshua Barney. And unfortunately, yes, what made everything a rout was while his unit pushed back the Redcoats, at least early on, Joshua Barney was shot in the leg. He collapsed, and ultimately he survived the battle. But with that, his fleeing militia just took off and ran. The whole line broke. At this battle, the Redcoats had 60 or more people that were killed, and only 10 to 15 on our end were killed. But here we are now. The British have a clear line directly to the Capitol, and they started marching. And we were marching, but it was most of the people in the city and fleeing militia that were marching in the opposite direction. The city was now completely open with no defenses, and the Redcoats just walked in. It was 7:30 p.m. Their first target was Capitol Hill, the U.S. Capitol building. At this time, no dome, but it was a beautiful structure. It still wasn't finished, but it symbolized everything about our democracy. George Cockburn was the first one in, walked inside, and he climbed into the speaker of the House of Representatives. He sat in his chair and he laughed and he asked his men, "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned?" "Yes," the reply came back. In the middle of the Capitol building, they piled furniture, everything they could find, curtains, books, desks, and then gunpowder. They threw a torch through the window. The flames raced all over the place. And yes, even though the walls survived for the most part, they were stone. The Capitol building's roof was wood. The bonfire raced up. The roof caught fire, and that was it. In the Capitol was the Library of Congress. In the Library of Congress were thousands of books that now were turned to ash. The Capitol was on fire. 8:30 p.m. Soldiers marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. At the end was the president's house, the White House. Inside, dinner was waiting on the table. Yes, there had been such a frantic move to escape that the dining hall had been prepared for a gathering that night. There was food ready to be served, silverware that was on the table. And the Redcoats just sat down and had the best meal that they had had in years. The house was then destroyed. In the same way, Everything was torched. The curtain, the staircases, the windows, everything collapsed. The president's home was now on fire. Thankfully, no one was killed on our end. Why? Because of Dolly Madison. She had seen them marching. She was up on the roof. She quickly gathered as many valuables as she can. She left a lot of personal belongings. But what did she do? With the help of the White House servants, this beautiful painting of George Washington was bolted to the wall. They couldn't get it down, so they smashed the glass frame, rolled out the painting, and just in the nick of time, with an hour to spare, they escaped the White House. But the Redcoats, after the White House was burned down, they moved to the Treasury building. They moved to the War Department. They moved to the State Department. And at the Navy Yard, one of the few places that the Redcoats did not burn down because the Americans had already set fire to their own ships to keep them from being captured. Just think about that. But this is important to know. There was a lot that was not burned. Private homes, churches, hospitals, most private civilian buildings were not burned. Remember, this is important to understand. This wasn't about destruction, massacre. This was about retaliation, revenge. The British didn't come to destroy the whole city. They came to punish the government. We had burned down the Canadian capital, today's Toronto, and this is what Britain wanted to do. Get revenge. The plan was to strike fast, damage morale, and leave the American forces so that they couldn't regroup. And that's what they did. A perfect example of this is that they were ready to burn down the patent office. This is where people's inventions, the documentation of everyone's inventions were stored. And they had the torches ready. They were ready to burn it down like every previous government building. That's when a gentleman by the name of Dr. William Thornton stepped in. Who was he? He ran the patent office. He was the architect of the U.S. Capitol. He was a passionate believer in inventions, not just Americans, but people throughout the world. As they were stacking the furniture, he pleaded with the officers. He said something powerful. These are not weapons. These are the discoveries of the human mind. To burn them would be to destroy the history of the world. He argued that all these models, plans, and inventions from across the world were not just American. He basically argued that destroying the patent office would be vandalism, not just war. Remarkably, the Redcoats listened. They lowered their torches and they walked away. But all around them, the city was burning. And then something unbelievable happened. As if by God above, divine intervention. It's happened so often in the history of the United States and will be happening again very shortly. 12:30 in the morning, rain started exploding from the heavens. Thunder cracked over the burning buildings. And yes, a hurricane came crashing through the city. Tornadoes, violent tornadoes ripped through the whole area. Everyone ran. And yes, because of this, the fires were immediately put out. This storm just didn't cool the city. This storm just didn't cause havoc. It, in fact, saved what remained of the city. By the morning, Washington was soaked. It was shattered. It was silent. Yes, the walls still stood, but they were charred. And it was nothing but an empty, burned shell. The whole Capitol was smoldering. The Redcoats, shaken by this storm and worried about a counterattack, people coming back into the city, left. They didn't stay. But their message was delivered. Their work here in the city was finished. They left behind smoke and ruin, in a nation, the United States of America, that was down and out and at their worst moment, you could argue, in the history of our country. But it was still a nation that refused to disappear. We got back up and went forward into a new day because there was going to be a new day, and we needed to be ready because the Redcoats were still not done. They moved on to Baltimore. But, friends, that's the story for another episode. Thanks for being with me on this journey. This has been the OK, Let's Learn podcast, where we learned about Washington, D.C. burning down to the ground on August 24th, 1814. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. Questions, comments, feedback, anything, and it's always appreciated anytime you can give me a 5-star review and a written review on Apple Podcast or your podcast provider of your choice. Until next time, friends, have fun and keep learning.